In the heart of a city that never truly slept, where the streets glistened with rain and the shadows held secrets that could destroy empires, there lived a man who commanded fear like other men commanded respect. His name was Enzo Moretti, and he was the undisputed boss of the most powerful mafia family the city had ever known. From his penthouse office that overlooked the sprawling metropolis below, Enzo ruled with an iron fist and a heart that had been frozen solid since the day he watched his father die in a pool of blood when he was just a small boy with big dreams. The city feared him, his enemies trembled at the mere mention of his name, and his own men would rather walk through fire than face his wrath. But what nobody knew, what Enzo kept hidden behind his cold gray eyes and his expensive suits, was that he was the loneliest man in the entire world. His mansion was a palace of marble and gold, filled with priceless art and furniture that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. But it was empty of warmth, empty of laughter, empty of love. The only person who brought any light into his dark existence was his mother, Rosa, who was slowly fading away in her room on the top floor, her body weak and her spirit even weaker, and Enzo visited her every single night to read her stories from the old books she loved so much, even though his voice cracked with emotion that he would never show to anyone else. Lena had been working in the Moretti mansion for nearly 2 years, and in all that time, she had learned to become invisible, to move through the grand hallways like a shadow, to clean and cook and tend to the needs of the household without ever being noticed by the terrifying man who owned it all. She was 23 years old, with honey-colored hair that she kept pulled back in a tight bun and eyes the color of warm chocolate that held a sadness she tried her best to hide. Lena had come from nothing, had grown up in the poorest part of the city where food was scarce and hope was even scarcer, and when she had found this job as a maid in the Moretti mansion, she had thanked God on her knees because it meant she could finally eat 3 meals a day and sleep in a warm bed. She had never met anyone like Enzo Moretti before, had never seen a man who could make the air around him feel so heavy and cold, and she would be lying if she said she wasn't terrified of him. Every time he walked into a room, every time his deep voice echoed through the halls, every time his intense gray eyes swept over her like she was nothing more than a piece of furniture, Lena's heart would pound so hard she thought it might burst right out of her chest. But Lena was also brave, braver than anyone gave her credit for, and she refused to cower like the other servants did. When Enzo would bark orders at her, she would look him straight in the eye and nod once, firmly, and something about that small act of defiance made him pause, just for a moment, as if he was seeing something he had never seen before. The night everything changed started like any other night in the Moretti mansion, with rain pounding against the windows and thunder rolling across the sky like angry gods fighting in the heavens. Enzo had been in his study for hours, surrounded by papers and contracts and documents that detailed the intricate web of his criminal empire, and he had been drinking steadily since sunset, the crystal glass of whiskey never leaving his hand for more than a few minutes at a time. His mind was a storm of worries and fears that he would never admit to anyone, not even to his most trusted men. His uncle, Salvatore, who went by the name Uncle Sal, had been circling him like a shark for months, making subtle moves to undermine his authority, whispering poison in the ears of his capos, planting seeds of doubt and betrayal that were beginning to sprout into something very dangerous. Enzo knew that Uncle Sal wanted his position, wanted to be the boss, and that the old snake would stop at nothing to take everything that Enzo had worked so hard to build. Adding to this pressure was his mother Rosa's failing health, which had taken a sharp turn for the worse in the past few weeks, and the doctors had told Enzo in hushed, pitying voices that she might not see the end of the year. The thought of losing his mother, the only person who had ever truly loved him, the only person who saw past the monster he had become, was enough to make Enzo want to scream into the void. But he couldn't scream, couldn't show weakness, couldn't let anyone see that beneath the cold exterior was a broken little boy who just wanted his mother to hold him one more time. Lena was in the grand living room, dusting the shelves that held ancient vases and golden figurines that were worth more than her entire life, when she heard the crash of glass coming from the study. Her heart leaped into her throat, and she froze, listening intently for any other sounds. There was a low groan, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps stumbling across the expensive Persian rug, and then the door to the study flew open, and Enzo Moretti stood there, swaying on his feet, his expensive silk shirt untucked and his hair disheveled, his gray eyes bloodshot and wild. He looked like a wild animal that had been cornered, like a king who had lost his crown, and for just a moment, Lena felt something other than fear for him. She felt pity, and that was a dangerous thing to feel for a man like Enzo Moretti. He looked at her, and it was as if he was seeing her for the very first time, really seeing her, not just as a maid who cleaned his home, but as a woman, as a person. He stumbled toward her, and Lena held her breath, clutching her duster like a weapon, ready to defend herself if she had to. But he didn't attack her, didn't even raise his voice. Instead, he stood in front of her, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath, could see the tiny lines of worry around his eyes that hadn't been there when she first started working for him. "You," he said, his voice thick and slurred, pointing a trembling finger at her chest. "You're the only one who isn't afraid of me. Everyone else runs away. Everyone else hides. But you just stand there like a brave little soldier." Lena didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond to this strange, vulnerable version of the man who normally treated her like she was invisible. She just stood there, her hands gripping the duster so tightly that her knuckles had turned white, and she watched as Enzo's eyes grew even more wild, even more desperate. His mother was dying. His uncle was betraying him. His empire was crumbling around him, and he was so alone, so terribly, terribly alone. And in that moment of drunken desperation, his mind latched onto an idea that was so insane, so reckless, that it would change both of their lives forever. He thought about getting married, about finding a wife who would stand by his side, who would make him look stronger in the eyes of his enemies, who would give his mother the happiness of seeing her son settled before she passed away. But he didn't want to go through the long, complicated process of courtship, didn't want to find a woman from a good family who would come with expectations and demands. He wanted simple, quick, easy, and Lena was standing right there in front of him, a woman who had proven she wasn't afraid of him, a woman who was already in his house, a woman who would have no choice but to say yes. "You're going to marry me," Enzo declared, his words coming out like a command, like an order that could not be disobeyed. "Right now? Tonight?" Lena's jaw dropped open in shock, and she stared at him as if he had grown a second head. She couldn't possibly have heard him correctly, couldn't possibly have understood what he was saying. Marry him? The terrifying Mafia boss who never even said please or thank you. The man who treated her like she was nothing more than a ghost in his home? It was absurd, it was insane, it was completely and utterly impossible. But Enzo wasn't waiting for her response, wasn't giving her time to process what he was suggesting. He grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not painful, and he started pulling her toward the door that led to the east wing of the mansion, where there was a small chapel that had been built by his grandmother for the family's private ceremonies. Lena stumbled after him, her mind reeling, her heart pounding, and she tried to pull her arm back, tried to protest, but her voice was frozen in her throat. She had never been good at standing up for herself, had never been good at saying no to anyone, especially not to someone as powerful and terrifying as Enzo Moretti. And so she let him drag her through the hallways, past the confused servants who quickly looked away, past the beautiful paintings that seemed to mock her with their silent stares. They reached the chapel, a beautiful little room filled with candlelight and the scent of old incense. And there stood a tired-looking judge who had clearly been dragged out of his bed to perform this bizarre ceremony. Enzo had made a call, had used his considerable influence to summon a man of the law in the middle of the night, and the judge looked just as confused and shocked as Lena felt. Enzo thrust her forward, positioning her in front of the altar, and he stood beside her with his shoulders squared and his jaw set, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. "Say the words," he commanded the judge, his voice sharp and impatient. The judge stammered through the ceremony, reading the vows in a shaky voice, and Lena's mind was screaming at her to run, to fight, to do something, anything, but her body wouldn't obey. She watched the judge's lips move, heard the words husband and wife, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, and it all sounded like it was coming from very far away, like she was underwater and unable to breathe. When the judge asked if she took Enzo to be her lawful wedded husband, Lena opened her mouth to say no, to refuse, to tell him that this was all a terrible mistake. But what came out was a tiny, whispered yes that she barely recognized as her own voice. Enzo signed the papers with a flourish, his signature bold and decisive, and then he pushed the pen into her trembling hand, forcing her to sign her name next to his, and just like that, it was done. She was Lena Moretti, wife of the most dangerous man in the city. Enzo didn't look at her, didn't say a word to her, didn't even acknowledge what had just happened. He simply turned on his heel and walked out of the chapel, leaving Lena standing there with the judge, both of them stunned and silent. The judge cleared his throat awkwardly and handed her a copy of the marriage certificate, and then he too fled, muttering something about needing to get back to his family. Lena stood alone in the beautiful little chapel, the candlelight flickering around her, and she looked down at the piece of paper in her hands that said she was a married woman. She had never dreamed of getting married, had never allowed herself to hope for such a thing, but if she had, she certainly wouldn't have imagined it happening like this, in the middle of the night, to a man who had never even asked her name. She slowly made her way back to her tiny room in the servants' quarters, her legs feeling like they were made of jelly, her mind completely blank, unable to process what had just happened. She fell onto her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling until the first rays of sunlight started to peek through the window, and she knew that when the sun fully rose, everything would be different, everything would be changed, and there was no going back to the simple, invisible life she had once known. The next morning, Lena woke up to the sound of shouting echoing through the mansion, and her heart sank into her stomach as she recognized Enzo's voice, loud and furious, and filled with a rage she had never heard before. She quickly got dressed, pulling on her plain gray uniform and tying her hair back in its usual bun, and she walked through the halls toward the source of the noise, dreading what she was about to find. When she reached the kitchen, she saw Enzo standing there, his face red with anger, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, and he was shouting at Marco, his loyal right-hand man, who was standing there with a look of utter shock and disbelief on his face. "I did what?" Enzo roared, slamming his fist down on the marble countertop so hard that a vase of flowers toppled over and crashed to the floor. "I married the maid. Are you out of your mind? I would never do something so stupid." Lena stood frozen in the doorway, watching this scene unfold, and she felt a sharp pain in her chest as she realized that Enzo didn't even remember what had happened the night before. He was so drunk, so completely out of his mind, that he had no recollection of dragging her to the chapel, no memory of forcing her to sign that piece of paper, no idea that he had just made her his wife. Marco pointed to Lena, who was still standing in the doorway, and Enzo's eyes snapped to her, and for a moment, there was confusion in his gaze, followed by a dawning horror as the memories of the previous night started to come back to him in fragments. He saw himself in the study, saw himself stumbling toward her, saw himself dragging her through the halls, saw the judge and the vows and the signature, and he felt his blood run cold. He had made a terrible, unforgivable mistake, and now he was married to his own maid, a woman he barely knew, a woman who was so far beneath his station that it was almost laughable. He strode over to her, his footsteps heavy and menacing, and he towered over her with his broad shoulders and his furious gray eyes. And Lena forced herself not to flinch, not to cower, not to show him how terrified she truly was. "This was an accident," he spat, his voice dripping with disgust. "A drunk, stupid accident. Forget it ever happened. It never happened. Do you understand me?" Lena nodded, not trusting her voice to speak, and Enzo turned away from her, dismissing her like she was nothing more than a piece of trash. "You will stay in the servants' quarters," he continued, his back still to her. "You will continue your duties as a maid. You will tell no one about what happened last night, not your family, not your friends, not the other servants. This is a secret, and it will stay a secret for the rest of our lives. Do I make myself clear?" Lena nodded again, and she watched as Enzo stormed out of the kitchen, Marco following close behind him, and she was left alone in the chaos of the mess he had made. She knelt down and started picking up the broken pieces of the vase, her hands shaking so badly that she cut herself on a sharp edge, and she watched the blood well up and mix with the water on the floor. She felt tears prickling at her eyes, but she forced them back, refusing to cry, refusing to show anyone how much his words had hurt her. She had never expected to be loved, had never expected to be cherished, but she had also never expected to be treated like she was nothing, like she was a dirty secret to be hidden away and forgotten. As she cleaned up the mess, she thought about her life before this moment, the simple, quiet life she had led, the small joy she had found in her work, the little moments of peace that had made everything bearable. And now, all of that was gone, replaced by this strange, horrible new reality where she was married to a man who hated her, a man who regretted her existence, a man who would never, ever see her as anything more than a mistake he had made on a drunken night. But even as she thought these things, even as the tears finally spilled down her cheeks, Lena made a silent promise to herself that she would not let this break her, that she would be strong, that she would survive. In the weeks that followed, Enzo pretended that Lena didn't exist, that the whole thing had never happened, and he threw himself into his work with a renewed ferocity that scared even his most hardened men. He worked 18 hours a day, barely sleeping, barely eating, and when he wasn't working, he was visiting his mother, sitting by her bedside and holding her frail hand as she drifted in and out of consciousness. Rosa was the only person who could see past Enzo's walls, the only person who could see the sadness and fear that he tried so hard to hide, and she worried about him constantly. She had heard whispers from the servants about her son's strange behavior, about the way he had been drinking more than usual, about the way he had been snapping at everyone, and she knew that something was wrong, something that he wasn't telling her. But Rosa was too weak to press him, too sick to demand answers. And so she just lay there in her beautiful bed, surrounded by pillows and flowers, and she prayed to God that her son would find peace, would find happiness, would find love before it was too late. Lena continued her work as if nothing had changed, cleaning the mansion, cooking the meals, attending to Rosa's needs, and she did it all with a quiet dignity that impressed even the other servants who had always looked down on her. But she couldn't help watching Enzo, couldn't help observing him from a distance, couldn't help noticing the way he would stand by the window in his study, staring out at the city with a look of such profound loneliness on his face that it made her heart ache. She started to see past the monster, past the terrifying Mafia boss, past the cold, cruel words he had spoken to her, and she started to see the broken little boy who was still grieving his father, who was terrified of losing his mother, who was surrounded by enemies on all sides and didn't trust a single soul. She started to see the man behind the mask, and the more she saw, the more she realized that she didn't hate him, that she couldn't hate him, that there was something about him that made her want to protect him, to comfort him, to show him that he wasn't as alone as he thought he was. One night, when the mansion was quiet and everyone was asleep, Lena was walking through the hallways, making sure all the doors were locked and all the lights were turned off, when she heard a sound coming from Rosa's room. She crept closer, her heart pounding, and she peered through the crack in the door to see Enzo sitting by his mother's bedside, holding her hand, and he was crying. He was crying like a little boy, the tears streaming down his face, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs, and he was whispering words to his mother that Lena couldn't quite hear but could feel in her very soul. He was telling her that he was scared, that he was sorry for all the bad things he had done, that he didn't want her to leave him, that he didn't know how to go on without her. And in that moment, Lena's heart broke for him, truly broke, and she felt a love bloom in her chest that she had never expected to feel, a love for this broken, hurting, desperate man who had never known what it was like to be truly loved in return. She backed away from the door, her own tears streaming down her face, and she went to her room and fell to her knees and prayed for him, prayed for his mother, prayed for all of them, because she knew now that this was bigger than a drunk mistake, bigger than a secret marriage, bigger than anything she had ever known. The very next day, Rosa called Lena to her bedside, and Lena went quickly, wiping her hands on her apron and smoothing down her hair, nervous about what the old woman might want. Rosa was awake and alert, her eyes bright and clear, and she reached out a frail hand to Lena and smiled. "My dear," she said, her voice soft and weak, "I have been watching you. I have seen the way you care for me, the way you care for everyone in this house. And I have seen the way my son looks at you when he thinks no one is watching." Lena's face flushed bright red, and she opened her mouth to deny it, to explain that Enzo felt nothing for her, that he regretted their marriage more than anything. But Rosa just shook her head. "I know about the wedding," she whispered, and Lena's blood ran cold. "My son cannot keep secrets from his mother. He told me everything, and I know he was cruel to you. But please, please don't give up on him. He has a good heart, Lena, a beautiful heart, but it has been broken so many times that he has forgotten how to let anyone in. Be patient with him. Be kind to him. Show him what love really looks like." Lena nodded, tears in her eyes, and she promised Rosa that she would try, that she would do her best, that she would never stop hoping for a miracle. And as she left the room, she felt a new strength filling her, a new purpose, a new determination to break through Enzo's walls and show him that he was worthy of love, that he deserved happiness, that his mistakes didn't define him. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, something shifted in the atmosphere of the Moretti mansion. Enzo continued to be gruff and distant, continued to bark orders at everyone and retreat to his study for hours on end. But there were small moments, tiny cracks in his armor, that Lena started to notice and cherish. She would catch him looking at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, would see something soft and confused in his gray eyes before he quickly looked away. He started to say thank you when she brought him his coffee in the morning, started to nod at her in acknowledgement when she passed him in the hallways, started to pause and linger when she was in the room, as if he was trying to work up the courage to say something, but always chickening out at the last moment. Lena, for her part, was patient and kind, never pushing him, never demanding anything from him, just being there, always being there, a steady presence in his chaotic life that he was starting to rely on more than he would ever admit. She continued to care for Rosa with the utmost tenderness, reading to her, brushing her hair, holding her hand, and Rosa would smile and whisper words of encouragement, telling Lena that she was doing a wonderful job, that she was the best thing that had ever happened to her son, that everything would work out in the end. Enzo was fighting a war on two fronts, and both battles were taking a toll on him in ways that he couldn't even begin to explain. On the one hand, there was his mother's declining health, which was breaking his heart piece by piece, and on the other hand, there was Uncle Sal's relentless scheming, which was threatening to tear apart everything he had worked so hard to build. Uncle Sal had been busy, very busy, whispering poison in the ears of the capos, making promises he couldn't keep, planting seeds of doubt and betrayal that were starting to take root. Enzo had always suspected that his uncle was a snake, but he had never imagined that the man would go so far, would be so ruthless, would try to take everything from him while his mother was dying and he was at his most vulnerable. The stress was eating him alive, making him sleep even less, work even harder, drink even more, and his usually impeccable self-control was starting to slip in ways that scared him. He would find himself snapping at his men for no reason, would find himself pacing his study for hours, would find himself staring at Lena with a desperate hunger in his eyes that he couldn't explain and couldn't control. Lena, meanwhile, was not just sitting around waiting for Enzo to notice her. She was a clever girl, much cleverer than anyone gave her credit for, and she had been watching Uncle Sal like a hawk since the very first day she had started working in the mansion. There was something about the man that made her skin crawl, something about the way he looked at Enzo that made her blood run cold, and she had made it her mission to figure out exactly what he was up to. She started paying attention to his movements, noticing when he would arrive and when he would leave, noticing the people he would meet with and the documents he would carry, and slowly, painstakingly, she started to piece together a picture of his treachery that was more terrifying than she had ever imagined. Uncle Sal was not just trying to take over Enzo's business. He was in league with their enemies, the Romano family from the other side of the city, and he was feeding them information, secrets, plans that could destroy everything Enzo had built. It was a betrayal of the highest order, a betrayal that would destroy Enzo's heart as thoroughly as it would destroy his empire, and Lena knew that she had to do something, had to stop it, had to protect the man she was falling in love with even if he never knew it. One night, when the mansion was quiet and everyone was asleep, Lena made her move. She had been watching Uncle Sal for weeks, had noticed that he always kept his most important documents in a small safe in his private office at the mansion, and she had managed to figure out the combination by watching him through a crack in the door. It was a risky move, the riskiest thing she had ever done, but she knew that if she didn't act now, it might be too late, that Enzo might lose everything before she had a chance to save him. She crept through the dark hallways, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure someone would hear it, and she made her way to Uncle Sal's office, her fingers trembling as she dialed the combination on the safe. It clicked open, and there, nestled among stacks of cash and incriminating photographs, was the document she had been looking for, a detailed letter from the Romano family, outlining their plans to help Uncle Sal overthrow Enzo and take control of the city. Lena grabbed the letter, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it, and she quickly closed the safe and crept back to her room, her mind racing with what to do next. She couldn't just give the letter to Enzo, couldn't just walk up to him and hand it over and expect him to believe her. He didn't trust anyone, least of all her, and she needed to find a way to make him see the truth without making him feel like she was betraying him or trying to manipulate him. The next day, Lena waited for the perfect moment to approach Enzo, and that moment came in the early evening when he was in his study, staring out the window with that same haunted look on his face that she had grown to know so well. She knocked softly on the door, and when he grunted for her to enter, she stepped inside, her hands clasped in front of her her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe. "I have to tell you something," she said, her voice coming out in a tiny, shaky whisper that made Enzo turn and look at her, his gray eyes narrowing in suspicion. Lena took a deep breath, steeling herself for his anger, his fury, his rejection, and she reached into her pocket and pulled out the letter from the Romano family. "Your uncle," she said, her voice stronger now, filled with a determination that surprised even her. "He's cheating you. He's in league with the Romano family. He's been giving them your secrets, your plans, everything. This letter proves it." She held out the letter to him, her hand trembling, and she watched as he took it from her, his eyes scanning the words, his face growing pale with shock and then red with fury. Enzo read the letter twice, 3 times, and with each reading, his rage grew until it was a living, breathing thing inside him, roaring and demanding to be unleashed. He crumpled the letter in his fist, his knuckles white, and he turned to Lena with a look of such intensity that she took a step back, afraid of what he might do. But the anger in his eyes wasn't directed at her. It was directed at his uncle, at the man who had betrayed him, at the family that had turned against him. "How did you get this?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Lena swallowed hard, her throat dry, and she told him the truth, told him about her weeks of watching, her late-night surveillance, her risky break-in, her desperate hope that she could save him from his enemies. She expected him to be angry, to yell at her for meddling in things that didn't concern her, to remind her that she was just a maid and had no right to interfere in his affairs. But instead, Enzo just stared at her, his expression softening into something that looked almost like wonder. "Why?" he asked, his voice cracking with emotion. "Why would you do this for me? I've been so cruel to you. I've treated you like you were nothing. I've ignored you and humiliated you and made you feel like a dirty secret. Why would you risk everything to help me?" Lena looked at him, really looked at him, and she saw the fear and vulnerability behind his fierce eyes, the little boy who was still crying for his father, the lonely man who didn't know how to love or be loved. She took a step closer to him, close enough that she could see the pulse beating in his neck, close enough that she could smell the familiar scent of his cologne. "Because you are not a monster, Enzo," she said softly, her voice filled with a tenderness that made his breath catch in his throat. "You are a good man who has been hurt too many times. And because you are my husband, whether you like it or not, whether you want it or not, and I made a vow to stand by you, to support you, to protect you. That's what wives do." Enzo's eyes widened in surprise, and for the first time since he had woken up on that disastrous morning, he truly saw Lena, saw her as his wife, saw her as the woman who had just risked everything to save him. He reached out a trembling hand and touched her face, his fingers brushing against her cheek with a gentleness that made her heart flutter. "You are the bravest person I have ever met," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "And I don't deserve you. I don't deserve your kindness, your loyalty, your love. But I'm going to try. I'm going to try to be the man you think I can be." That moment, that beautiful, tender moment, was interrupted by a loud crash from somewhere in the mansion, followed by shouting and the sound of breaking glass. Enzo's protective instincts immediately kicked in, and he pushed Lena behind him, shielding her with his body as he prepared to face whatever threat had just invaded his home. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice hard and commanding. "Do not leave this room. Lock the door behind me and do not open it for anyone. Do you understand?" Lena nodded, her heart pounding with fear, and she watched as Enzo strode out of the room, his hand reaching for the gun he kept hidden in his desk drawer. She did as he said, locking the door behind him and pressing her ear against the wood, listening to the sounds of chaos that were erupting in the mansion. She heard shouting, heard gunshots, heard people screaming and running, and her heart was in her throat as she prayed to God that Enzo would be okay, that he would survive, that he wouldn't leave her alone in this cold, empty mansion. The minutes stretched into an eternity, and Lena was just about to open the door and go looking for him when she heard footsteps approaching, heavy and measured, and then a knock on the door. "Lena," Enzo's voice called out, and she nearly collapsed with relief. "It's me. It's safe now. Open the door." She unlocked the door and threw it open, and there stood Enzo, his shirt torn and his face smeared with blood, but alive. Thank God, alive and whole. He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly that she could barely breathe, and she felt him trembling against her, felt the fear and relief coursing through his body. "Uncle Sal," he said, his voice muffled against her hair. "He sent men. He tried to take over the mansion, but we stopped them. Marco and the others, we stopped them all. He's gone now. He ran like the coward he is. But it's not over. It's not even close to being over." Lena pulled back and looked at him, her hands cupping his face, wiping the blood from his cheek. "I'm okay," she whispered. "I'm okay because you protected me. You saved me." Enzo looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of love and fear and determination, and he made a vow to himself right then and there that he would never let anyone hurt her, would never let anyone take her away from him, would never let her go. He was in love with her, hopelessly, completely, irrevocably in love with her, and he would do whatever it took to keep her safe and happy and by his side for the rest of their lives. The attack on the mansion was a turning point for everyone, a moment that shattered the illusion of safety and forced them all to confront the reality of their dangerous lives. Uncle Sal had fled, but he was still out there, lurking in the shadows, planning his revenge, and Enzo knew that it was only a matter of time before he struck again. He had to be proactive, had to take the fight to his uncle before his uncle could bring the fight to him. And that meant making some very difficult decisions that would put everyone he loved at risk. But for the first time in his life, Enzo wasn't just thinking about himself, wasn't just thinking about his empire and his power and his reputation. He was thinking about Lena, about the woman who had risked everything to save him, the woman who had shown him that he was worthy of love, the woman who had given him a reason to fight for something other than money and power. He was thinking about his mother, about the woman who had loved him unconditionally his entire life, the woman who was fading away with each passing day, the woman who deserved to see her son happy before she left this world. And he was thinking about his men, the loyal soldiers who had stood by him through thick and thin, the men who had put their lives on the line to protect him and his family from the traitor who had tried to destroy them. In the days following the attack, Enzo started to change, started to become softer, more open, more vulnerable, and it was Lena who was the catalyst for this transformation. He started spending more time with her, not just in passing, but really spending time, sitting with her in the evenings and talking about nothing and everything. He told her about his childhood, about his father, about the day he had watched him die, about the promise he had made to himself to never be weak again. He told her about his mother, about the woman who had raised him single-handedly after his father's death, about the sacrifices she had made to keep him safe and give him a good life. He told her about his fears, his hopes, his dreams, all the things he had never told anyone before, not even Marco, not even his own mother. And Lena listened, really listened, with a compassion and understanding that made him feel seen and heard in a way he had never experienced before. She didn't judge him, didn't pity him, didn't try to fix him. She just accepted him, all of him, the good and the bad, the light and the dark, and that acceptance was more healing than any medicine or therapy could ever be. One night, when the mansion was quiet and the only sound was the rain pattering against the windows, Enzo found himself outside Lena's room, his hand raised to knock, his heart pounding with a nervousness he hadn't felt since he was a teenager. He had been thinking about her all day, about the way she smiled, the way she laughed, the way she looked at him with those warm brown eyes that made him feel like he was the only person in the world. He had been thinking about their wedding night, the way he had treated her, the cruel words he had spoken, the coldness he had shown her, and he felt a deep, burning shame that he couldn't shake. He had to apologize, had to make things right, had to tell her how he really felt, even if it scared him, even if it meant opening up his heart to the possibility of getting hurt. He knocked softly on the door, and he heard her footsteps approaching, heard the lock click, and then she was standing there, her hair loose and flowing over her shoulders, her eyes soft and warm, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his entire life. "Lena," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I need to talk to you. Please." She nodded and stepped aside, letting him into her small, simple room, and he looked around at the space that was so different from his own opulent quarters. There were no expensive paintings, no golden figurines, no priceless antiques, just a bed, a small table, a chair, and a few personal belongings that spoke to her humble origins. It was the room of a servant, a room that was far beneath the wife of a Mafia boss, and Enzo felt a fresh wave of guilt for the way he had treated her, the way he had relegated her to this space while he lived in luxury just a few floors above. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other in their eagerness to be heard. "I'm so sorry for everything. For the way I treated you on our wedding night, for the way I ignored you, for the way I made you feel like you were nothing. You are everything, Lena. You are the most important person in my entire life, and I have been too stupid, too scared, too proud to admit it. I love you. I have loved you from the moment I saw you standing there, brave and fierce and not afraid of me, and I was too scared to admit it because I didn't think I deserved you. But I'm not scared anymore. I'm not going to hide from my feelings anymore. I want to be with you. I want to be your husband, really your husband, not just on a piece of paper. I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy, protecting you, loving you. Please, Lena, please tell me that it's not too late. Please tell me that you can forgive me and give me a chance to be the man you deserve." Lena looked at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, and she felt her heart swelling with so much love that she thought it might burst. She had been waiting for this moment for so long, had dreamed of hearing these words from him, had hoped and prayed that he would one day open up to her and let her in. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, and she led him to sit on the edge of her small bed, sitting beside him and looking into his gray eyes that were so full of hope and fear and longing. "I forgive you," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "I forgave you a long time ago, Enzo. I saw the good in you, even when you couldn't see it yourself. I love you too. I've loved you from the moment I heard you crying in your mother's room, from the moment I saw the little boy behind the monster, from the moment I realized that you were just as broken and scared and alone as I was. I don't care about the past. I don't care about the mistakes. All I care about is the future, our future, together." Enzo let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding, and he pulled her into his arms, holding her close, feeling her warmth against his chest, feeling her heartbeat against his own. He had never been this happy, never felt this complete, and he knew that this was just the beginning, that there were still challenges ahead, still dangers to face, still battles to fight. But as long as he had Lena by his side, he could face anything. The next morning, Enzo woke up in Lena's small bed, their bodies tangled together, her head resting on his chest, and her hair spread across his skin like a golden halo. He looked down at her sleeping face, peaceful and beautiful, and he felt a surge of love so powerful that it took his breath away. He gently kissed her forehead, and she stirred, opening her eyes and looking up at him with a sleepy smile that made his heart skip a beat. "Good morning, husband," she whispered, and he laughed, a real laugh, the first one he had laughed in years. "Good morning, wife," he replied, and he pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair and breathing in her scent. They lay there for a long time, just holding each other, just enjoying the simple pleasure of being together. And when they finally got up and dressed, there was a new lightness in the air, a new energy, a new hope that hadn't been there before. Enzo took Lena's hand and led her to the kitchen, where the other servants were already at work, and they all stared in shock as the fearsome Mafia boss held hands with the young maid who had always been so invisible. But Enzo didn't care about their stares, didn't care about the whispers, didn't care about anything except the woman who had changed his life and made him a better man. He took her to his mother's room, and Rosa was awake and alert, a knowing smile on her face as she watched her son and his wife enter her room. "I knew it," she said, her voice weak but filled with joy. "I knew you two would find your way to each other. I have been praying for this moment, and God has answered my prayers." Enzo knelt by his mother's bedside, taking her hand and pressing it to his cheek, and he told her everything. All the secrets he had been carrying, all the fears he had been hiding, all the love he had been holding back. He told her about his plan to take down Uncle Sal, about the evidence Lena had found, about the courage and loyalty she had shown him, about the way she had opened up his heart and shown him how to love. Rosa listened, tears streaming down her face, and she reached out her other hand to Lena, pulling her closer and squeezing her fingers. "You are the daughter I never had," she said softly. "You have given my son something I could never give him. You have given him hope. You have given him love. You have given him a reason to live. I am so grateful to you, Lena, and I am so proud to call you my daughter." Lena wept, tears of joy and gratitude, and she promised Rosa that she would take care of Enzo, would love him and support him and stand by him no matter what happened. Rosa smiled, a peaceful, contented smile, and she closed her eyes and whispered a prayer of thanks to God for bringing them all together. But even as they celebrated their new love, the threat of Uncle Sal loomed large in the background, a dark cloud that threatened to destroy everything they had built. Enzo knew that he had to act, had to eliminate the threat once and for all, and he gathered his most trusted men, including Marco, to plan the final confrontation. They would meet Uncle Sal on neutral ground, would expose his treachery in front of all the families, would strip him of his power and his dignity and his freedom. It was a dangerous plan, a risky plan, but it was the only way to ensure that Lena would be safe, that his mother would be safe, that his empire would be secure. Lena begged him to be careful, to not take unnecessary risks, to come back to her in one piece. And he promised her that he would, that nothing would keep him from returning to her, that he had too much to live for now to throw his life away in a foolish act of bravado. He kissed her goodbye, a long, lingering kiss that said everything words couldn't express, and then he left to meet his destiny, his heart full of love and his mind full of determination. The day of the confrontation arrived, and the whole city seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Enzo had called a meeting of all the major families, a gathering that would decide the fate of his empire and the future of everyone he loved. The meeting was to take place in an old warehouse on the docks, a neutral location that no one family could claim as their own, and Enzo arrived with his most trusted men, including Marco, who was ready to fight and die for his boss and friend. Lena had wanted to come, had wanted to stand by his side and show her support, but Enzo had refused, insisting that she stay home and take care of his mother, insisting that her safety was his top priority. She had argued, of course, had insisted that she was brave enough to face the danger, but he had been immovable, and in the end, she had agreed to stay behind, promising to pray for him and wait for his return. Uncle Sal was already there when Enzo arrived, surrounded by his own men, a smug expression on his face that made Enzo's blood boil with rage. The old snake looked so confident, so sure of himself, so certain that he was about to win the ultimate prize. But Enzo was calm, collected, and he walked into the warehouse with his head held high and his shoulders squared, ready to face his uncle and expose him for the traitor he truly was. The other family bosses were there, seated around a long table, their eyes watching the confrontation with a mixture of curiosity and anticipation. Enzo took his place at the head of the table, and he looked at his uncle with a cold, hard stare that made the older man shift uncomfortably in his seat. "Uncle Sal," Enzo said, his voice echoing through the warehouse, "I have called this meeting to expose you for what you truly are. A traitor, a snake, a man who would destroy his own family for power and money." Uncle Sal laughed, a hollow, brittle sound that didn't reach his eyes. "You have no proof," he scoffed. "This is just the desperate accusation of a man who is afraid of losing everything." But Enzo was ready, and he pulled out the letter that Lena had risked everything to find, the letter that proved Uncle Sal's treachery beyond any shadow of a doubt. He read it aloud, his voice steady and strong, and he watched as Uncle Sal's face went pale, watched as his confident smile crumbled into a mask of fear and rage. The other family bosses listened in shock, their eyes wide with disbelief, and when Enzo finished reading, there was a moment of stunned silence before chaos erupted. Uncle Sal leaped to his feet, screaming accusations, denying everything. But it was too late. The proof was there in black and white, and everyone could see that he was guilty. Enzo's men moved forward, surrounding Uncle Sal and his cronies, and the old man's plans crumbled to dust around him. He had lost, completely and utterly lost, and he would spend the rest of his life in a prison cell, paying for his crimes, never again able to threaten Enzo or anyone he loved. As Uncle Sal was dragged away, screaming and cursing, Enzo felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a weight that had been pressing down on him for years, and he took a deep breath of the warehouse air, which suddenly smelled sweeter, fresher, more alive. The meeting ended with Enzo stronger than ever, his enemies defeated, his allies reaffirmed, his empire secure. But he didn't care about any of that, not really. All he cared about was getting back to Lena, to his wife, to the woman who had saved him from himself and given him a reason to live. He drove back to the mansion as fast as he could, his heart pounding with excitement. And when he walked through the front door, there she was, waiting for him with open arms and tears in her eyes. He swept her up in a hug, twirling her around, and he kissed her with all the love and passion and gratitude that was overflowing in his heart. "It's done," he said, his voice muffled against her hair. "It's finally done. He's gone. We're safe. We're free." Lena laughed, a happy, joyful sound that made his heart soar, and she kissed him back, her arms wrapped tightly around his neck, her body pressed against his. "I never doubted you," she whispered. "I knew you would win. I knew you would come back to me." Enzo pulled back and looked at her, really looked at her, and he saw his whole future in her eyes, a future filled with love and happiness, and the kind of peace he had never known was possible. He got down on one knee, right there in the foyer of his mansion, in front of all the servants and all the men who were still celebrating their victory, and he pulled out a small velvet box that he had been carrying in his pocket for months. "Lena," he said, his voice shaking with emotion, "I married you in a chapel in the middle of the night, in front of a judge who barely knew our names. I treated you like a servant, like a secret, like a mistake. But you are not any of those things. You are my heart, my soul, my everything. And I want to marry you again, properly, in front of God and everyone we know, in a church with flowers and music and a big white dress. I want the whole world to know that you are my wife, and I am your husband, and we are going to spend the rest of our lives together. Will you marry me, Lena?" Will you give me a second chance to do things right? Lena's tears were flowing freely, streaming down her cheeks, and she nodded, unable to speak, overcome with so much joy that she thought she might faint. Enzo slipped the ring onto her finger, a beautiful diamond that sparkled in the light, and he stood up and kissed her again, their love story reaching its beautiful, perfect climax. The second wedding was everything the first one had not been. It was held in the grand cathedral on the hill, the one where Enzo's parents had been married, and Lena walked down the aisle in a beautiful white dress that had been made specially for her, her honey-colored hair flowing over her shoulders like a golden waterfall. Rosa was there, seated in the front row, her eyes bright and her smile wide. And she was healthy, healthier than she had been in years, because the joy of seeing her son so happy had worked a miracle in her body. Marco was Enzo's best man, standing proudly beside him, and the other servants were there too, dressed in their finest clothes, their faces beaming with happiness for the couple they had come to love and respect. The ceremony was beautiful, the vows heartfelt, the celebration joyful, and when the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Enzo and Lena kissed with a passion that made everyone in the church erupt in applause. They were finally, truly, completely married, their love no longer a secret, no longer a mistake, but a beautiful, public declaration of their devotion to each other. The reception was held at the mansion, which had been transformed into a wonderland of flowers and lights and music. There was dancing and laughter and toasts, and everyone celebrated the union of two people who had found love in the most unexpected of circumstances. Enzo and Lena danced together, their bodies moving as one, their hearts beating in perfect rhythm, and they didn't notice anyone else, didn't hear the music or the chatter or the laughter. All they saw was each other. All they felt was each other. All they needed was each other. "I love you," Enzo whispered into her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "I love you more than I ever thought it was possible to love anyone." Lena smiled, a radiant, beautiful smile that made his heart skip a beat, and she whispered back, "I love you too, Enzo. I will love you for the rest of my life, and even after that, I will find you in the next life and love you all over again." As the night wore on and the celebrations continued, Enzo and Lena snuck away from the party, seeking a moment of quiet togetherness in the garden that overlooked the city. They sat on a bench, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting on his chest, and they looked out at the twinkling lights that spread out before them like a million tiny stars. "This is our city now," Enzo said softly, his voice filled with wonder. "Our home. Our kingdom, and you are my queen." Lena laughed, a soft, happy sound, and she turned to look at him, her eyes shining in the moonlight. "I don't want to be a queen," she said. "I just want to be your wife, your partner, your best friend. That's all I've ever wanted." Enzo kissed her forehead, his heart overflowing with love, and he knew that he was the luckiest man in the world, that he had been given a second chance at happiness, that Lena was the best thing that had ever happened to him, and he would spend the rest of his life thanking God for bringing her into his life and giving him the courage to love her. In the months that followed, Enzo continued to lead his family with strength and fairness, but he was a changed man, a man who had found love and purpose, a man who was no longer ruled by fear and anger and loneliness. He treated his men with respect, his servants with kindness, his enemies with mercy, and the whole city noticed the transformation, wondered what had happened to the fearsome boss who had become so soft, so gentle, so human. But only those closest to him knew the secret, knew that it was Lena who had wrought this miracle, Lena who had shown him the power of love, Lena who had given him a reason to be a better man. Rosa lived for many more years, her health restored by the joy of seeing her son so happy, and she doted on her daughter-in-law, treating her like the daughter she had always wanted. Lena and Rosa would spend hours together, talking and laughing and sharing secrets, and Enzo would watch them, his heart so full of love that it ached. He had never imagined that his life could be this good, that he could be this happy, but he had been wrong, had underestimated the power of love, had underestimated the strength of the brave girl who had walked into his life and changed everything. And so, the story of Enzo and Lena became a legend, a tale told and retold throughout the city, a story of love that was born in the most unlikely of circumstances, a story of two people who found each other against all odds and built a life together that was filled with happiness, respect, and unwavering devotion. They had their challenges, of course, their ups and downs, their moments of doubt and fear, but they faced them all together, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. Lena continued to work in the mansion, not as a servant, but as the lady of the house. Her humble origins no longer a source of shame, but a badge of honor that proved that true love knew no boundaries of class or status. And Enzo, the fearsome mafia boss who had once ruled with an iron fist, became a devoted husband, a loving father, a respected leader who governed with his heart as much as his head. Now it's your turn to create your own love story. Enzo and Lena's journey proves that love can blossom in the most unexpected places and that even the toughest hearts can be softened by the right person. What are your thoughts on their incredible journey? Do you believe that a strong love can truly change a person's destiny? Share your reflections and feelings about their story in the comments below. Tell us how their roller coaster romance impacted you. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartwarming stories of love and redemption. Your support helps us share even more inspiring tales of romance, bravery, and the incredible power of true love. We would love to hear from you. What challenges did Enzo and Lena face that most resonated with you? What moment in their story touched your heart the most? Share your own stories of unexpected love, and let's build a community of dreamers and romantics who believe that everyone deserves a happy ending. Together, we can prove that even in the darkest times, love is always worth fighting for.